kick off, I want to bring up Reverend Stevie Kraft, open in prayer. And Reverend Kraft is coming up from New Jersey. He is a JPS member of the Jumper Society and also instructor at Camp Constitution. And we have a table next door at the Home Street Show. That's what brings him here. So please let us all stand and let Reverend Kraft open in prayer.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Quoting from the German theologian Martin Luther, he said, quote, "I am afraid that schools will prove to be the gates of hell unless they diligently labor in explaining the Holy Scriptures, engraving them in the hearts of youth. Therefore, I advise no one to place his child where the Scriptures do not reign paramount."
Amen.
Amen. He was prophetic when he said that. How much more today in the 21st century do we see the truth of that prophecy being played out in government schools? That's why this presentation that Dr. Pesta does is so important. Like Brother Hal said, no one will fall asleep in here. In fact, when you leave here, not only will you be educated, but you may be very angry. But remember the words of Jesus: be angry and sin not. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come in the mighty, majestic name of our Lord and Savior, Christ Jesus, Son of the living God. Father, your word declares in James chapter 1, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally to all who ask, but if they ask in faith without doubting. Father, we're in perilous and treacherous times today in our nation. We are losing our nation because we have lost our biblical moorings. We've lost our spiritual foundation. We have gone astray. And you said the wicked shall be turned into hell and all nations that forget God. But we thank you for brothers and sisters you raised up, like Dr. Duke Pesta, that has come to sound the alarm and to let us know that a hope is not lost if we have ears to hear and eyes to see. And that if we will take what we learned tonight and apply it, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of our precious children and our grandchildren, leaving a legacy and a heritage for righteousness' sake. We come against every principality of hell, for this is a spiritual war. We come against those who would not only dumb down our kids, but to indoctrinate them in satanic ideology. And we pray, Father, tonight that the eyes of our understanding will be opened and that we will leave this place not depressed because of this Common Core nonsense, but we will leave here with a vision to move forward and to see righteousness restored once again in our great land. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Oh, yes.
Okay, be seated. And I want to just recommend some items we have on the table in the back. And by the way, the facilities, go take a right and go right across if you need to use the restrooms. The New American Magazine, published by the John Birch Society, is a bi-monthly publication. We have a special reprint which contains 2 articles. It has those devices they use to get the child's responses. So that's a little article about that. You can take one free. If you want more, they're 3 for $1. And I know we're all activists, so you should all grab plenty of them, right? I have a 1-hour DVD with Duke Pesta and his colleague, Mrs. Mary Black. It's about a year and a half old. These are $2 a piece, and they're available out there. That's also on YouTube. You can put in Duke Pesta on YouTube. There's going to be like 1,000 videos. You might have a 5-minute video. You might have a 5-hour one, right? So they're all good. My dear friend Sam Blumenfeld couldn't make it today. He's now 89 years of age. He's a pioneer in the homeschool movement. And back in the 60s, he realized there was a serious reading problem. He's authored about 15 books in his useful life. His last one is Crimes of the Educators. Now, this is my only copy. I just got it from Sam a couple of days ago. It's published by WorldNet Daily, and it's available on Amazon. I highly recommend it if you're want to be knowledgeable. This doesn't deal with Common Core. It deals with what led up to Common Core. didn't just happen overnight. It happened over 100 years ago, folks. People like John Dewey and Horace Mann and all these other folks that most of us, until recently, probably never heard of. Sam put together something called Alpha Phonics many years ago to teach not just children, but also adults how to read using intensive phonics. Sam would say, you don't need puppets popping out of trash cans to teach people how to read. He said you use, no, we homeschooled 5 of my children, we all taught my children, my wife and I, using this simple step-by-step method. And there's not one picture in here, and not one puppet popping out of a trash can. So I got a few of these available at only $10. And even adults who have trouble reading can learn from this. And finally, the entity paying for this room is Camp Constitution. Reverend Kraft is one of our instructors, and maybe one day we'll have Duke, hopefully sometime, maybe next year. It's a week-long summer camp. It's in Ridge, New Hampshire. It's an all-volunteer entity, and we've never turned away any worthy campers or any worthy families. We've had a really good reception. We're across the street at the folk school convention. And you see a lot of homeschool people here because half of them are staying here tonight. So anyway, make yourself available with information. And I'm going to introduce Dave Drake, who's the outreach director at Freedom Project Education. He'll introduce Duke. And the Freedom Project Education is our educational offshoot of the John Birch Society. I just have one warning. Duke Pesta is a Shakespeare scholar, and he actually thinks Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. But we'll overlook that minor character flaw. Thank you. Dave?
Thanks, Al. Good to be here. I don't usually have the opportunity to travel with Duke because he's going, whenever he flies, we try to keep the cost down for those people who are going to listen to him. So I don't usually get to try. It worked out this time because we actually have a booth over at the conference too, and so we have our full van, we have our full booth, and so I get to be part of one of the long ones. Duke and I originally started this probably back in 2013. We started going around Wisconsin, and we did 125, 130 talks just in Wisconsin before it started getting out of Wisconsin, and then he started flying, and now he's been in almost 40 states. So it's been exciting to do that. Duke he's a full professor at the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, so he does that full time. He's also the academic director of Freedom Project Education. We're an online school. We have brochures up here if you're interested. As Hal said, this was an idea of a number of the people that were with the John Birch Society. Alan Scholl, who's been with JBS for I think almost 30 years, and homeschooled for 29 years. He had this idea to how do we bring educated our professors or type people to help homeschoolers, and the idea went from there. We've been in school for 4 years now. We started with 22 high school students 4 years ago. We were just short of 600 this year. We're planning on to be somewhere between probably 900 and 1,000 this year because we're just growing so fast. Common Core wasn't something we intend to ever play off of, but it's working well for us. So if parents want, we're probably not the solution for every family, but we can be the solution for many, many families. And we can do individual classes if mom wants to teach 1 or 2 classes, dad wants to teach a class. We can help out with the extra classes that they don't want to teach. Or if the family situation is that you want us to do the full curriculum, we can do that K through 12. Okay? We are an accredited school, and so we are certainly an option for families across the United States. We are in 50 states now and about 9 countries. So we're not just tied to just the United States. We work very well with missionaries, families who want English taught by somebody that knows English. American history, American studies are classes we offer. Logic, Latin, and philosophy are also the thinking classes from a Christian perspective. So again, I'm here if you'd like, and then we have a few of these program guides that have all of our class listings. We'll take enrollments through August 14th or when the classes are full. We already have 4 sections of classes full at this point. So it's going very quickly. As I said, Dr. Pesta is also our academic director. Besides that, virtually every weekend that's not a holiday weekend or basically a holiday weekend, Duke has been on the road. So he does the traveling. I try to make sure that he doesn't get stuck in an airport. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Dr. Pesta to come up and talk about how things have changed since the last time you've heard from him.
done a lot of Common Core talks. We've been all over the place. I'm gratified to say that in 2.5 years of doing this, everything we said was going to happen is happening. Everything the people who support Common Core told you was going to happen isn't happening. This wasn't state-led. It's not improving our kids' education. The tests are a disaster. They can't even administer the tests, let alone have fair tests. Revolts all across the country, moms and dads beginning to speak out. So what I'd like to do is take you through a good overview where I'm going to tell you who did it, how they did it, why they did it, and then we're going to look at the standards and get a sense of why these are so dangerous. I assume we do have homeschool people here, and I'm grateful. I assume because if you're a homeschool person or you're at the convention and you're here, it's because you recognize that if the federal government is indeed taking over public school education, not to educate but to indoctrinate, and that's what this is. If that's happening, then they're not going to let you alone. A lot of homeschool moms and dads are what I like to call bunker moms and dads. And I understand the sentiment entirely. Thank God we've got our kids safe at home. We're not exposing them to this. But then we sort of turn our backs on what's happening in the larger culture, and sooner or later, once they sew everything up, they're not going to let you guys alone. So it's one of these things that we're going to, I want homeschool diversion, but we've got to have moms and dads in homeschool who are still actively fighting this in the culture, so you can, not for the culture, but for your families. And so your kids and your grandkids can homeschool one day if they want to. So let's start real broad. First of all, can everybody in the back see okay? We need to dim the lights at all? You all right? Okay. Let's start with what Common Core is. Oh, one last thing, I didn't hear Hal mention it. In order to get you on a Friday night out of here early without having to take a peek too long, let's hold our questions till the end. This way, anybody who wants to stay and ask them can, and I'll stay as long as you need me to. But if we ask questions every 4 or 5 minutes, we're going to be here for 4 hours, and you don't want that. So, what is Common Core? Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math. Science is already being fed into your schools. Every aspect of your kids' curriculum in the public schools will be Common Core aligned, including art, music, physical education. I've seen a prototype for the new Common Core physical education standards. Your kids are going to be writing in gym class more than they're actually exercising. And the things they're writing about Michelle Obama's nutrition program, right? How to eat health. This is the kind of stuff that every aspect of the curriculum is going to be revamped. And this is really dangerous. Massachusetts, you took the English and math standard. You did not agree to any other standards. You took English and math. And yet, simply by virtue of taking those two standards, every subsequent standard will be dumped into your schools without consulting you now. You didn't agree to anything else, but you're going to get it on that. And that's a big problem. So transparency matters. They call themselves the Common Core State Standards because they want you to believe the states did this. But a simple question to start with. If states did it, Common Core, shouldn't the states be able to walk away? If this is genuinely state-led, states should be able to get out of it, right? And what happens to every state that tries to pull out a Common Core? The federal government threatens and blackmails them. You've, I'm sure, heard about all over the country how moms and dads are opting their kids out of these tests. Have you all heard that? Well, I don't know if you're aware of this. I haven't even had time to put it in the slide on this. When I get home, I'm going to add it to the slide presentation. 3 days ago, Army Duncan, the Secretary of Education in Washington, he came out and said, if moms and dads keep opting their kids out of our tests, the federal government will have to intervene to make them take those tests. Please tell me how this is state-led. Already, homeschool states that require testing are starting to transform the requirements to force homeschool moms and dads to take Common Core tests. Oh, you can still homeschool. But now the tests you take to verify will have to be Common Core tests. None of this is state-led. So why do they call it state-led? I guess the question is, why did they call the Affordable Care Act affordable? I mean, nobody believed it then, and no one believes it now. Everybody knows it's going to be expensive and more expensive. But whenever the federal government appropriates to itself things it has no business doing, they always give it these kind of names. This is an important lie. What you're going to get today is the top 5 or 6 lies of Common Core that you've been told again and again. It's almost like mantra-like hypnosis. Common Core is rigorous. Common Core is benchmarked. Common Core is state-led. None of it's true. And I should say, too, as we open here, every single piece of information you're going to see today, it's going to be documented. And I'm going to give it to you free. All you have to do, grab a card from me or from Dave. We'll email you all the slides. So every piece of information you're going to see you can have for free. I urge you to take it and verify it. I mean, the problem, we're in this problem because we trust people we don't know. You don't know me. So I'm not asking for your trust. I'm asking you to listen. In 350 talks in 40 states, nobody has ever written back to me and said, that's not true. So when you're done here today, not only will you understand exactly what Common Core is and how it works, but I'm going to give you all of our information, all of the documentation. Take it, have it, use it. Because the people who tell you Common Core are all those wonderful things, they never prove it. Your principal says, oh, it's rigorous. Ask them, wait, how could they know Common Core is rigorous when right now in your Massachusetts schools they're testing it for the first time? It hasn't been tested in 6 years since they conceived it. How can they tell you it's rigorous when they haven't even begun to test it yet, but they've been telling you for 6 years? Hold your politicians, hold them accountable the same way. When they tell you it's better than what we have, and you're the one state in the union that I can honestly say it's not better. You had the best standards in the country. And Deval Patrick and the Secretary of Education threw them away for about $400 million and took these ridiculous Common Core standards. You had world-class standards in this state, and you trashed them for this. You knew those standards worked. By trial, by evidence, by test, by college application and enrollment, you knew they worked. You gave them away for this, for a big bucket load of federal money and the crony relationship between Patrick and Barack Obama. That's why you did it to your kids. And if there's one aspect of Common Core that is unforgivable, it's how our superintendents, our principals, our state school leaders, as we can call them that, the DPI, the Department of Public Instruction, and the federal government, how they have given away our kids' educational standards and replaced them with something that is very broad and very shallow. We're going to talk about it. But they call them the state standards. That's the first lie of Common Core. Let me prove to you that it's not state-led, because this is a big one. If it's state-led, then we should be able to walk away, then the states control it. They've gotten moms and dads to think that maybe it's okay if the states did it. Well, who wrote it? 2 Washington lobbyist groups. Shocking, I know, but that's who did it. These 2 groups, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Now that all sounds very impressive, especially the, well, that's where it's national, that's where it's state-led, right? The governors did it. Who is the NGA? If you go to their website, you will find that the National Governors Association is a trade organization, a lobbyist group. Their purpose is to put donors and politicians into contact with each other. Lobbyists, politicians, and donors. It's a lobbying group. Their own website acknowledges that. Let me prove to you that the governors didn't do this. Does anybody know who the sitting governor of the NGA, the chair, the honorary chair of the NGA was for a good deal of time that Common Core was being put in your schools? Not Chris Christie.
Arkansas governor.
All good guesses. It was the governor of Oklahoma, Mary Fallin. And what's really important about that is about a year ago, Mary Fallin, the governor of Oklahoma, pulled Oklahoma completely out of Common Core. And she said one of the main reasons she did it is because the states weren't consulted. See, I really do, I wish 50 state governors locked themselves in a room and banged out education standards. Now, that strikes you as incongruous. What qualifies your governor to write academic standards? Nothing. I've got the most conservative governor in the country, in Scott Walker. He's not qualified to write education standards. None of your governors are. So why do I prefer that? Because if the governors did it, you can always unelect the governor, can't you? You have some democratic representation. If the governors did it, you control the governors ultimately. So here's the copyright for Common Core. Please tell me how Common Core is state-led. When the copyright itself tells you these 2 lobbyist groups wrote it, the NGA Center and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and the sole developers of the Common Core state standard. And by the way, you see the hypocrisy? Neither one of these 2 things has anything to do with the states. They're private, K Street, Washington lobbyists. And yet, they named the program, they completely wrote and developed, they call them the state standards. You can see this federal bait and switch over and over again. And so that begs another question. If did it and not lobbyist groups did it and not the states, how can you say it's federal? One thing you need to know right when we start, people ask me this all the time, well, if the federal government wanted to take over education, why didn't they just do it the way they took over health care? Because legally they couldn't. 3 different federal statutes dating from 1965 prohibit the federal government of the United States from establishing national standards or national curricula. To say nothing of the fact that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits the federal government from meddling in state educational decisions. Those are the reasons they couldn't do it. There was nothing like that for Obamacare. So what they did, the next best thing, they allowed these 2 lobbyist groups with a lot of money and a lot of help to write the standards and copyright them so that they could say, they're not federal, we're not breaking the law, these are state-led. That's how they worked this. And that's pretty shocking if you think about it. And look at this from another respect, too. American education is public. It belongs to you and me. Our kids and grandkids are the stakeholders. Everything depends on them. And yet, you've got unelected, unaccountable people who you can't reach. Massachusetts, if you decide you don't like that, how do you reach these people? The governors, at least, you can call their office and demand and run a candidate against them. How do you get to these people? And I'm going to stop using the term public education because it's not public education anymore. This is government education. That's what's happened here. And what they've done through the copyright is hide that fact. And I don't know why it took 6 years, but we now have our first state governor, Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, who's suing the federal government because this is illegal, what they've done. You can masquerade any way you want, but it's still illegal. And 16 different state governors are considering joining Jindal's lawsuit. Alas, your governor's not one of them. I'm sure that surprises you. We go back here. So where'd they come from? You got these 2 Washington lobbyist groups. And the irony is that there really were only 5 people, 5, in those 2 lobbyist groups who did the bulk of the writing of the standards. And at lower levels, people pitched in. But in fact, I see some of you taking notes. The name I would ask you to write down is Joy Pullman, Pullman. Joy works for the Heartland Institute in Chicago. And she has written a definitive article on the 5 people who wrote Common Core. It wasn't done by state, it wasn't done by the irony is, your legislature was never consulted about this. Your teachers never consulted about this. Your teachers' unions were never consulted about this. Nobody here, and your moms and dads certainly weren't consulted about this. All this was done off the grid behind closed doors. And so you've got 5 people in these 2 lobbyist groups, and one name I want to share with you in particular. The man who's called the chief architect of Common Core, the man most responsible, is a fellow by the name of David Coleman, C-O-L-E-M-A-N. And the liberal Huffington Post calls David Coleman the most powerful education official that nobody's ever heard of. He is, on his Wikipedia page, he is considered the architect of the standards. He, more than anybody else, oversaw the process. Do you know what he's doing now? No sooner did David Coleman write the standards, orchestrate them, than he immediately left Common Core. And right now, he's the president of the College Board, where the same guy who wrote the standards is now in charge of rewriting the SATs, the exams your kids are going to have to take to get to college, to conform to his Common Core standards. You see how staggering that is. Another little tidbit about David Coleman, he has no educational training whatsoever, ever, nothing. He's never had a classroom. He's never had a class in education. He's never studied educational theory. He's never educated children or high school kids. None. Zero. Nada. No experience. He wrote the standards with the help of other people, and now the feds allowed him to become in charge of the test your kids are going to have to take to get to college. Do you see, homeschool moms and dads, the potential existential threat of this? You educate your kids at home in a godly or a conservative or a traditional manner, and now when they get to the point where they graduate from high school and they want to go to college, the ACTs and the SATs will be Common Core compliant. So without having to threaten homeschooling at all, simply by allowing the same guy no one's ever heard of to write the standards and then take over at the college boards, they've already blackmailed states and schools. Why did 176 Roman Catholic diocese schools take Common Core the first time they could without being asked to? Because of this. They're terrified. It's kind of moral cowardice. But they're terrified that in a few years, their kids won't look as good on the tests. And that if the kids don't look as good on the test, you're not going to spend all that money to send your kids to those schools. So we got to start conforming, right? Half the Protestant schools, Lutheran schools, Methodist schools, Baptist, about 50% of them have already gone Common Core. Because they're terrified. I call this is educational terrorism. when you allow people like this, unelected people like this, behind closed doors, to completely transform and take over American education. I mean, think about this. The people who wrote and implemented this paradigm, this Common Core, that is transforming your kids' schools, they're unaccountable to anybody. Anybody. Okay, so you got 2 Washington lobbyist groups. You got 5 individuals headed by David Coleman. Well, who paid for it? Well, that would be our good friend Bill Gates of Microsoft. As you sit here today, Bill Gates has spent over $6 billion on Common Core. $6 billion of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation money. $6 billion. It won't surprise you, I think, to learn that there's not a single major educational entity in this country that supports Common Core that was not paid to do so by Bill Gates. Gates has paid everybody. All the 501c3s, all the lobbying groups educationally, Gates money. Who was it? Roman Catholic Church. Could it be that the Roman Catholic Church is putting Common Core in the schools without even being asked? Because the NCEA, the National Catholic Education Association, the chief watchdog of our Catholic schools, has taken hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants from Bill Gates. As a matter of fact, the only thing Bill Gates has spent more of his money on than Common Core is abortion, euthanasia, and birth control in Africa. He's kind of a nice partner for the Catholic Church. How about the National PTA? The National PTA, whose job it is to watch out for our kids, right? They've taken 4 different $1 million grants from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You know, the National PTA was advertising for Common Core in the States before the standards were even written, before they even seen them. This is what Gates has done. And can I ask you, what qualifies Bill Gates to be in charge of American education? What qualifies? The thing that's so ironic about this is that these people have no qualifications for what they've done. So you got a billionaire in Bill Gates who paid for it. You got 5 individuals and 2 lobbying groups. All right. That doesn't tell me why it's federal. In fact, that sounds anything but federal. 2 private lobbying groups, 5 individuals, Bill Gates. Well, how did it get in American government schools? How did it get there? You know, you've been watching your government for the last 40 years, right? Whether there's been Democrats or Republicans in office. Is this a federal government that just lets you walk in and do things that it does? No way. You're just going to let the Department of Education, going to let people off the grid take over? No. So how did it get in your schools? I don't care how many billions of dollars Gates has, he does not have the power to put this in your schools. It was the federal government, it was the Department of Education. How many of you have heard of the Federal Race to the Top program? Remember what that was? Remember back in 2008, 2009, when the outgoing Republican Bush and the incoming Democrat Obama told us that unless we coughed up billions and billions of taxpayer dollars, banks and car companies, the whole economy would crash. What you don't know, you'll hear it today, is that over $1 billion of that absolutely critical stimulus money was turned right over to the Department of Education. And they used it to begin to create the tests that will go along with these standards. The feds did it. The Race to the Top program was basically a stimulus for education. In 2009, the federal government started offering grants to every state in the union. For example, in 2009, New York became the first state in the union to receive a Race to the Top grant. They got $700 million from the feds, your money. It went right to the New York Department of Education, and they could spend it on whatever they wanted to. Substitute teachers, computers, right? Anything they wanted. Do you know what the only the top was? Proviso and Race to the Top was? Any state that took Race to the Top money was legally obligated to accept the Common Core state standards when they were finally written. That's how 46 states, including New York, got it. They took some form of Race to the Top money, and in so doing, they signed a contract. When they took that money, they had to accept the English and the math standards when they were written. That's how. In other words, your federal government bribed 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards that nobody had seen. It's true that after Massachusetts took the standards, that some people, some teachers, educators in your state got to see them, but they couldn't change them, they couldn't edit them, they couldn't revise them, they couldn't reject them. Your state took it, they got to see it. That's about all that happened. And that's the whole 9 yards on it. Again, this is so easy to verify. Even the pro-Common Core people don't really want to argue about it anymore. How many of you have heard, can we just talk about the standards? They're just standards. Because they don't want to talk. I think it matters how you got them. So let me give you an example of why it matters. Do you think the people who support Common Core right now would still support it if they were exactly the same standards, but instead of Bill Gates and his 6 evil Koch brothers, who threw $6 billion? What do you think the newspapers would be saying every day if it were the Koch brothers who put $6 billion into this? Wouldn't they confront all your raving liberal Massachusetts newspapers? Wouldn't they be talking about how rogue billionaire buys public education? Wouldn't they have to ask those questions? Wouldn't they be right to ask those questions? Now, isn't it funny that nobody's ever asked that question about getting 6 years into this? $6 billion a year Gates has pumped into this, and nobody's ever asked that question. You know, it's been estimated, and we'll see just a little bit further, that at least 70% of Americans radically upgrade their technology, their computer capacity, their bandwidth, to be able to offer the kind of test Common Core requires. Whose computers do you think are going to the schools? They're Gates computers, right? But nobody asked this question. Why is it, and this is what gets me, that whenever we talk about Common Core, we're always told that those who don't like it are politicizing it. How come nobody ever asked the politics of the people who did this? How come nobody ever has asked what the political motivations were for the people who did it? So off-the-grid people do this, but that's put in your schools, and we're the ones who politicize it. And that's the way the media works. But you get my point, right? If it had been the Koch brothers who put in $6 billion, and instead of a very liberal president, get a very conservative one, who basically bribed 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards nobody had seen with taxpayer money, I guarantee you your superintendents would hate it. They'd fight it tooth and nail. Your newspapers would be relentless in condemning this. But they're not. And that's where you sit right now. So, the problems with Common Core started immediately. And I say this too, I said this in the afternoon talk, and I mean this. For simply criticizing what they did, they simply tried to alert people to what the situation is. They call you, their whole argument on the pro-Common Core side is about, I'm going to give you the whole argument. Anybody who opposes Common Core is a tinfoil hat wearing, teabagging, right-wing political lunatic. That's the argument. And tell me we haven't seen this before, by the way. I mean, this is exactly what they do. You remember when during the Obamacare debate, where you were told if you oppose Obamacare, you just want people to die in the streets? That was successful, wasn't it? Remember the last presidential campaign, where you were told that it is the latest feminist agenda with regards to abortion, then you just was waging a war on women. You remember that one? And it's the same thing with Common Core. If you oppose Common Core, well, you just don't want standards. Right? In other words, you can have our standards or no standards, right? Not the standards, Massachusetts, that you already had, that were created by Massachusetts people, and that were really, really world class. You can't have those standards. Right? So you got rid of the good ones and took these. But I decided, I made a decision about a year and a half ago doing these talks, and I was only met with that. Right winger, right winger, right winger, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rest of the day, and I'm going to show you why Common Core isn't going to work, why it's a fiasco, and why it's a disaster. Why it's going to indoctrinate, not educate your kids. But I'm going to show you exclusively through left-wing voices. Every piece of information I'm going to show you comes from the left, and oftentimes the radical left. Because if the only argument is this is a right-wing problem, it's made up, then let's see how you call these people right-wingers, okay? Let's start with the two chief lawyers at the Department of Education when this mess started. The two lawyers who the Department of Education hired to make sure they were being within the parameters of the Constitution. Both of those lawyers said no. The Department of Education is overstepping its boundaries. What the Department of Education is doing is illegal. Here are they, right? With respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education concluded that, quote, these standards and the tests, the assessments, will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states across the Union, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program and raising a fundamental question about whether the department has exceeded its statutory boundaries. Now that they're no longer with the Department of Ed, they've written a 40-page white paper available free of charge at the Pioneer Institute, where they lay out the illegality, the case of Common Core. And you can go see that yourself. All right, again, I'm an English professor, so words are my business, but I'm going to play a little word game with you. I'm going to give you 5 words. And I want you to tell me if there's any way you can rewrite these 5 words to make them come out conservative. Are you ready? New York State Teachers Union. What do you think? Any way you could turn that? Well, because look, no, a year ago in January, the board of New York's Teachers Union on Saturday unanimously voted to withdraw support for the Common Core standards as they are being implemented, and they want that guy fired. He's the guy, this is not state-led. In your state, the governor and your superintendent of schools made the decision. In New York, that man alone did. He's the superintendent of public schools. The legislatures weren't consulted, the taxpayers, the voters, the teachers unions, none of them were consulted. One individual in most cases made this decision. You took money and you got stuck with all of this. The New York State United Teachers, a union that represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in the state of New York, is also asking the Board of Regents to remove John King from office. And although the union previously backed the Common Core standards, it now says it will not support the education benchmarks, quote, either as implemented or interpreted. Not the way you wrote them, and not if you try to revise them, just get rid of them. That's New York. How about the NEA, the National Education Association? How about the largest teachers union in the country? And now that the UAW has had was kneecapped by the federal government, that's the most politically active union in the country. When my governor, Scott Walker, took on the teachers unions in Wisconsin and beat them, he was recalled. That union spent over $150 million of its teachers' dues trying to get Governor Walker thrown out of office, and they failed. So this is no right-leaning organization. Here's what they said in February of last year. The nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for the Common Core state standards, labeling the rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education Association President Dennis Van Roekel said, quote, the standards will not succeed without a major course correction, including rewriting the standards and revising the test with teacher input. That's a big deal. The second thing that makes Common Core absolutely federal is the fact that the only way we have to measure it are these big national tests. The only way your kids are going to be evaluated on Common Core are those multi-week tests they have to take. Who controls those tests? It's not the state of Massachusetts. It's not the governor of Massachusetts. It's not the teachers. Those tests are controlled through Washington, D.C. All the data and information gathered on your kids, it reports to the Capitol, doesn't report to you. That's why it's federal. Because whoever controls those tests controls what your kids do and what your teachers teach. Your teachers are primarily going to be evaluated now on how well they get their kids to do on those tests. So consequently, whoever controls the tests controls the teachers. We're going to see a little bit more of that coming up. It's kind of a big deal, isn't it? And what the union's telling you is, you can't evaluate teachers on tests they didn't write, tests they don't get to see, tests they don't get to revise, tests the results of which they don't get for the individual kids sitting in their classes. How do you hold teachers accountable for that? And you guys get this, right? It's not like the unions have suddenly had a come to Jesus moment and are going to vote for conservative governor and have president like that. But this proves the point I'm trying to make. The unions have woken, who all dramatically supported this at first because it's big government, it's big money being spent. Now they don't want it. Why? Because they realize that they are not in control of their teachers anymore. The feds are in control of all of it. And if I have to choose between the unions and the feds, I'll hold my nose and choose the teachers union every time. Because this federal government, as you're going to see, right? But you know how it is in politics, right? The enemy is my enemy is my friend. It is just shocking that they continue to tell you that Common Core is a tinfoil hat right-wing issue. It's not. The screams and howls from the left are every biz deafening us from the right. And by the way, Dennis Van Roppel's not the president of the NEA anymore. He lost the presidency to a woman, a female candidate, who ran on an anti-Common Core program. How's that, right?
Wow.
And now you got, how about the nation's second largest teachers union? How about the American Federation of Teachers? Oh, and this by far is the more progressively radical of the two unions. This is the really left-wing one. And notice the date, 8 months ago in July. In a major surprise, the American Federation of Teachers, the country's second largest teachers union, opened its convention by announcing a step back from support for Common Core. The AFT will now provide monetary grants to teachers who want to criticize the standards or even write entirely new ones. Think about what that means. If you're a teacher in a state like Massachusetts, and the teachers union wants Common Core, and the state wants Common Core, how do you dare speak out against it? You've got no protection. People keep saying, well, teachers seem to like Common Core. They've got no choice. The ones who don't like it have been, I got a folder at home this thick from all the states I've been to. Letters from superintendents and principals threatening teachers. This is America, you have the right to free speech, but not in this classroom. You either get on board with Common Core or you find yourself a new job. And you know what's interesting? In a state like New York, where the teachers union backed out of Common Core, guess what's happening in New York now? Teachers are speaking out by the thousands. Why? Because the teachers know now that if they speak out, the union will support them if the state tries to fire them. In a state like Massachusetts, where the teachers are caught between the union, who's going along, and the state, how do you voice? If you're a teacher, what do? Right? You have no control. Your career is based on how your kids do on these exams, and you have no say over it. The AFT's executive council, well, we said that. How about this? Common Core has also seen other opposition from the left as well, particularly from a new faction of almost 100,000 left-wing teachers who call themselves the Badass Teachers Association, and many of whose members also belong to the AFT. The Badass Teachers, or the BATs, they're over about 150,000 now. They formed almost exclusively to fight Common Core from the left. Believe it or not, the Badass Teachers are standing arm in arm with Tea Party activists across the country because they both have this in common. And what do they both agree on? What Common Core does to special needs kids and the kids who are already struggling. It's the kiss of death for those kids. And that's why these two groups have mobilized. And one of my personal favorites, how about President Obama's backyard? How about the Chicago Teachers Union? And when you say the Chicago Teachers Union, by the way, this has got to be the most radical, progressive, crazy city teachers union in the country. Do you know who their Martin Luther King Day speaker was for the elementary school kids? The Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Love that. Kind of hard to turn that into a right-wing group, right? The lady in the picture, that's Karen Lewis. She is the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. And, you know, Karen is an avowed Marxist socialist. That's her politics. And she was actually going, and you know how I know she's a Marxist socialist? She was going to run for mayor of Chicago, and she was going to run to the left of Rahm Emanuel. I didn't think you could get anything but dryer lip between the left and Rahm Emanuel. But she was going to run. Now, I think she's developed cancer, so she dropped out of the race. But she's still the president of the Chicago Union. Let me give you a direct quote. This is all direct quote from Karen Lewis, and notice the date, May of 2014. Quote, I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy. That's all the data gathering. It also represents an overreach of federal power into state educational autonomy. Can I just put my professor hat back on for one more minute? The word of the day, kids, is irony. I will use it in a sentence. It is ironic that a Marxist socialist sees Common Core as too much government. Now that's she's right. When you got Karen Lewis telling you that Common Core is too much government involvement, all right? How about this? We have any teachers here, by the way? Okay, teachers, you hold me accountable if I'm telling a lie here, right? Karen Lewis says, Common Core eliminates creativity in the collaboration room and impedes collaboration. As teachers, Aren't there days when you have to close the book, set the curriculum aside, because you got 25 kids staring at you with deer in the headlight looks? The best teachers are the ones who can go off script, who can create, who can put everything away and figure out how to reach the kids sitting in front of them. How do you do that when the whole thing is orchestrated? How do you do that when the whole thing is top down and screwed? You can't. Screwed down, you can't. That's what Karen Lewis is telling you. We also know, and she's right about this, we also know that high-stakes standardized tests are designed to rank and sort our children, and they contribute significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in American schools. And she's 100% right. You know, do you honestly think, does anybody honestly think, you're going to create one exam for 60 million kids and it's going to tell you anything? There is no way you can create one exam for every third grader in the country that's going to tell your teacher what your daughter's doing in that class. It's impossible. They prove nothing, these tests. They are meaningless. And yet, and we've been doing standardized testing for 40 years. By the way, anybody know when this craze for national testing started? It really got started when we created the Department of Education. We managed to educate American kids quite well in this country for a couple hundred years, until we created the Department of Education. And all those billions of dollars that used to go directly to the states now had to funnel through the Department of Education. So they of course, they wanted to hold on to as much of that money as they could. So what did they do? They hired, believe it or not, they hired textbook companies like Pearson, McGraw-Hill. They hired textbook companies to create big national exams. And guess what those exams in the early 80s proved? Gee, our kids are stupid all of a sudden. Wait, so you got textbook companies whose job it is to sell you new stuff every year. And their tests proved that our kids were failing. You know, think about it. I was alive in the 1970s. I was a wee young, very young, but I was alive. And I remember the 1970s. It's not like in the 1970s, moms and dads started saying, gee, our kids are stupid. It's not like universities like the one I teach at in Wisconsin started turning kids away because they didn't know anything. Who concluded that our kids were failing? It wasn't teachers, it wasn't parents, it wasn't colleges, it was these exams. So guess what we had to do? We threw out all the curriculum, all the pedagogy, all the textbooks, and we had to buy all new. And have you noticed over the last 40 years, every 4 or 5 years we throw everything out and start over? Because who's making money off of this, right? The people who wrote the tests. Do you know how much money the Smarter Balance and the Park consortiums are making every year testing your kids? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and the tests prove nothing. And that's why I'm confident that sooner or later Common Core will go away. Not because we'll get rid of the idea, but because we'll rename it and have to sell you more stuff. Right? That's what this is. I mean, think about it. We managed to put a man on the moon. We created the generation we educated the generation that put a man on the moon with less technology available to them than your cell phone. The phone in your pocket has more technology on it than the stuff we use to get people to the moon. And we somehow characterize that educational system as a failure. Who did it? These people, the Department of Education, big government, in conjunction with a couple of hand-picked companies. Could I give you one more point? And we got teachers here, you hold me accountable. Nothing has changed as far as mathematics education. Nothing has changed in math for kids from 5 years old to 15 years old. Nothing. Have we invented a new number and slipped it in somewhere? Have we been inventing new geometrical theorems that I'm old? No. I get that when you're dealing with calculus, but I'm talking about 90% of your kids' math education in elementary, middle, and high school. It hasn't changed in 2,000 years. And if that's true, shouldn't you be able to buy one textbook and use it for 60 years? Of course. And if that's the case, then companies like yours have made no money. And so what is this all about, Common Core? What it is you've got a small group of crony capitalist companies, like Microsoft, for instance, who are getting rich doing this. And what does the government get? They get power and control, right? And that's what Marxist socialist Karen Lewis is telling you. And not only did Karen Lewis say this personally, but the Chicago Teachers Union crafted 30 different anti-Common Core resolutions. Can't read them all, just read you a couple. Here's the Chicago resolution. Quote, instructional and curriculum decisions should be in the hands of classroom teachers who understand the context and interests of their students. Doesn't that make sense? The professional educators should be the ones to try to determine the best way to teach. It's not going to happen in Common Core. How about this? The education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. The first person to tell you that Common Core is not appropriate education for your kids, I'll tell you a lot, it's the Chicago Teachers Union. And we'll see that. She's right about that, too. And this is really big. Notice the date here. A couple months ago, January 2015, the entire Washington State Democrat Party called for an immediate pullout of Common Core from the state of Washington. This is a big deal. If you're a Democrat in Washington, let's face it, Washington State is every bit the big liberal state that Massachusetts is. All right? And so if you're going to run for office in Washington State, and let's face it, most people who run for office in Washington State are Democrats. If you're going to run, you have to adopt this plan, or you get no state money. A couple of months ago, and if I didn't tell you it was Washington State Democrat Party, you would think what you're about to hear came right from the Tea Party. Listen to what the Washington State Democrats said. The Central Committee of the Washington State Democrat Party passed a resolution roundly condemning the Common Core standards. This is the first time a statewide Democrat Party committee has taken a public position against Common Core, and it happened in the backyard of the Gates Foundation, who paid for all of this. So in Chicago, Barack Obama's backyard, the Chicago Union has absolutely repudiated it. In the state of Washington, Seattle, where Gates has his organization, the whole state Democrat Party has repudiated it. Here's the resolution. Whereas the copyrighted and therefore unchangeable Common Core standards are a set of controversial, top-down academic standards that were promulgated by wealthy private interests without any research-based evidence that they're going to work, and that are developmentally inappropriate in the lowest grades. And whereas, as a means of avoiding the U.S. Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibition against federal meddling in state education policy, can I just do a little dance? You got Democrats writing the Constitution. Right? Whereas, as a means of avoiding the Constitution, state-led, you say, two private, unaccountable trade associations, the NGA and the CCSSO, have received millions of dollars in funding from the Gates Foundation, whereas the U.S. Department of Education improperly pressured state legislatures into adopting the Common Core and the high-stakes tests as a condition of competing for federal race-to-the-top stimulus funds. Money that should have been doled out based on need, not on coercion, and whereas the implementation of Common Core is going to cost local school districts hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for standardized computer-based tests, new technology, new curricula, and teacher training, at a time when Washington State is already insufficiently funding K-12 basic education. All this for something that has no proven benefit to students. And whereas states have already begun the process of pulling out of Common Core, therefore be it resolved that we call upon the Washington State Legislature and the Superintendent of Public Instruction to withdraw from Common Core and keep K-12 education student-centered and accountable to the people of Washington State. That's amazing. And Massachusetts, how come the liberals that run your state aren't looking out for your kids the way they are? Because this has nothing to do with right-wing morons, as they call us, right? Nothing to do, there's no tinfoil anywhere near this. Look, you give me a week, I'll lay out the whole conservative case against Common Core. You give me another week, I'll lay out Christian scholars' objection to Common Core. But we don't even need to go there. Because obviously, we live in a weird world, don't we? Where the political letter in front of your name determines whether your facts are true or not. Okay, fair enough. Don't listen to me, don't argue with me. Let's see what these people are doing. I don't see a conservative in the room yet, right? Up on the board here. How about this? I mentioned this to you. You took roughly $600 million, Massachusetts, one way or another. More, probably, if we ever had an accurate auditing of your books. But certainly no less than $600 million you took to take this nonsense. That's more than it's going to cost your state in 1 year just to do the testing. Did you get your money's worth? Let me give you an example. California. The state of California, notice the date here, 3 months ago, January 3rd, 29th, 2015. The state of California could be liable for as much as $1 billion a year in costs if a group of California school districts succeeds in winning reimbursement for expenses associated with the implementation of computer-based tests in the Common Core and other standards. 4 unified Santa Vallejo districts, Santa Ana, Vallejo, Plumas, and Porterville, and the Plumas County Office of Education filed a claim to classify the new tests as state mandates. Well, of course they are. But no school district in California took the standards. The state took it. The state took it and said, you're going to have to teach it. Then guess who's responsible for paying for the tests? It's not the schools, it's the state. And when we say the state, that means who's going to pay for this? You are, right? And I know they call you Taxachusetts. I know that. I've heard that in Wisconsin, right? Yeah. But can you afford every year what you're going to have to spend? Is it worth the money you spend? This is California. If the Commission on State Mandates agrees, and I don't see how they can't, if the State Mandate Commission says no, it's not the state's responsibility, then those schools are going to have to shut their doors, aren't they? Where are they going to come up with this money? And so what happens? The districts contend that unlike the old pencil and paper tests, the new computer-based tests require districts to buy computers, expand internet bandwidth capacity, install wireless connections, hire computer technicians, and train staff. In its filing, Santa Ana, the biggest of the 4 school districts with about 50,000 students, said it expects to spend about $12 million this year and last year alone on devices and bandwidth expansion, including another $124,000 on staff time. The claim estimates that the statewide cost for all districts for 1 year to test these kids at $1 billion. California took about $900 million to take Common Core. You got ripped off, right? They took $900 million. They're going to spend all that this year alone just to test those kids. And then, this is state-led, right? Okay, it's state-led. If it's state-led, then why are the feds threatening every state that wants to pull out? Note the date here, January 31st, 2015. I already explained Chicago to you. So this is what's wonderful. The entire state of Illinois is on board with Common Core. The entire state of Illinois is testing all their kids, except the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago said they're only going to offer these meaningless tests to 10% of their student body. That's it. And for that, the federal government is threatening to withhold Illinois' entire education budget for this year. How do you argue that it's state-led when that's happening? Chicago Public Schools' decision to administer new tests, Common Core tests, to only about 10% of the city's 600 schools could cost the state over $1 billion in federal aid. In a recent letter to Illinois School Superintendent Christopher Koch from Assistant U.S. Education Secretary Deborah Delisle, made it clear the state could lose as much as $1.17 billion in federal education funding next year if Chicago schools don't comply with Common Core testing requirements. Do you understand now what I mean when I say whoever controls these tests controls what your kids do, what your teachers teach? That's why the feds are threatening. The whole state of Illinois is on board, except for this one district, right? And for that, the feds say, you either test all those kids, every one of them, or we're cutting you completely off. The states have nothing to do with this. This is a federal takeover of education, and you're going to be the ones paying for it. But don't listen to me, because, you know, I got my silly little Wisconsin shoes on. You may not like bald guys. I understand. The great thing about all this is you don't have to listen to me, because the people who did this to you told you exactly why they were doing it. How many of you have heard the argument that Common Core is rigorous? How many of you have heard the argument that Common Core has been measured and benchmarked? Okay, let's listen to what Bill Gates has to say about this. Here's Bill Gates in 2013.
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
So in 2013, 2 years ago, Bill Gates said, It would be nice to know if our education stuff is going to work. But we're not going to know that for 10 years. How can you argue it's rigorous when they don't even know it's going to work? How can you argue it's been benchmarked when the guy who paid for it says, it'll be 2013 before we have any idea if it works? You know, way back in 2002 when George Bush gave us No Child Left Behind, it took about 10 years before we figured out it was a disaster and got rid of it. How much money was thrown down that rat hole? And you're going to wait another 10. How many kids have been miseducated in that generation? Now you're going to throw more money down this rat hole for what? The difference between Common Core and No Child Left Behind, by the way, the only difference is that if you don't stop Common Core, then you will never be able to fix education in Massachusetts again because it'll all devolve from the feds. You got your act, Massachusetts. You got your act together. Could reassert control over your kids' education. You could tomorrow reinstate the Massachusetts standards that you used before this. If you did that, then the feds would be out of your hair. Oh, and keep in mind too, that $1.17 billion that the feds are cutting from Illinois, that's less than 7% of the state's overall education budget. Does that give you a sense of the magnitude of numbers we're talking here? The feds are going to withhold over $1 billion from Illinois. That's only 6% of what Illinois spends on education every year. But now ask yourself this. Do you understand, Massachusetts, how easy it would be for you to make up that? In your case, it's 5%. The money you get from the federal government amounts to about 5% of what you spend every year on education in the state. Get the feds out of it. You could make that 5% up easy, right? You would add another toll. My God, add another toll. Right? And dedicate it. You make that 5% up. You pay that 5% yourself, and that you can tell the feds to kiss your behind. You don't do anything they say. You had better standards. What did you sell your soul for? And how many of you have heard? Now, I think the single biggest, the most dangerous lie of Common Core is this one. How many of you have heard this? Common Core is just a set of standards. It's not curriculum. Teachers can teach what they want. We'll think about that for a second. Your teachers went home one bright June morning for summer vacation. They came back in September, and all the textbooks had been pulled. And in their place were new Common Core textbooks, or better yet, a lot of uploaded stuff onto the computers by companies like Pearson. How did your teachers learn how to teach Common Core? The only thing they had was the pedagogy, the textbooks. The idea that the standards, you can reach the standards any way you want is BS. All the old textbooks are gone. Your teachers are being forced to teach from what's been handed to them. And the textbook companies who did this, companies like Pearson, they were in the room working with the Common Core people about how to create the textbooks. How do you argue they're separate? Well, don't listen to me. Let's listen to Bill Gates on this. Listen to this little gem.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arne Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests. Next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
When the tests are aligned to the Common Core standards, and right now your kids are being tested, then the curriculum will line up. When your teachers, as they're finding out right now, figure out that the only thing on those tests is the Common Core stuff, they will have no choice but to teach what we want them to. Do you understand the insidiousness of this? And did you also hear him admit that that money got siphoned away from the stimulus package and given to Arne Duncan? Arne Duncan, your Secretary of Education. You know he's never been a classroom teacher. How do we elect to the highest to the highest educational office in the land, somebody who's never been a teacher? Do you know what Arne Duncan's background is in? He's a sociologist. That makes perfect sense. And a basketball player, yeah. And there's that too, right? Both David Coleman and Bill Gates happen to be homosexuals, right? Not Bill Gates, I'm sorry, David Coleman and Arne Duncan. And the interesting thing about this is, with regards to the question of that $350 million stimulus, why would you appoint a sociologist to the chief educational office in the country? Well, I think you're already beginning to see that Common Core really was never meant to be about education. It's about sociology. It's about reshaping your kids, about driving a wedge between parents. And you'll see that coming up between parents and children, about convincing your kids that they belong primarily to the state and not to you. You'll see that very shortly. But, again, don't listen to me. You really think that these are benign standards that give your teachers all kinds of flexibility to meet them? Well, that's David Coleman. That's the guy who wrote them. Now in charge of the SATs and all the advanced placement exams your kids are going to have to take. He's rewriting. I want you to listen to what David Coleman said about your teachers' freedom. Because your state politicians have been guaranteeing you our teachers are free. Your state teachers union has been telling you we can teach what we want. Okay, are you going to believe them or are you going to believe the guy who wrote the standards?
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand waving. There's no amount of saying they teach the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
Bigger than the king. President, he's bigger than the king. There is no force on this earth that's going to prevent your teachers to teaching to our test. So when you go and you take this to your principal and your superintendent, they're going to look at you glassy-eyed and tell you the lie again. No, our teachers are right? They're going to tell you this was state-led, the governors did this. All they've got left is repeating the lies. There's nothing else. There is no argument. There is no evidence for anything they tell you. That's what's so maddening about this. You don't need me. The people who did this told you what they were doing. I'm going to play that again. Short clip. Take it from him. Listen to the arrogance. Listen to the definitiveness of this.
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand waving. There's no amount of saying they teach the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
There's David Coleman. And how about the future president of the United States?
Oh my God.
1 week ago, 5 days ago, in Iowa, she was asked about Common Core. 5 days ago. Listen to this.
You know, when I think about the really unfortunate argument that's been going on around Common Core, it's very painful. How do we end up at a point where we are so negative about the most important non-family enterprise in the raising of the next generation, which is how our kids are educated?
The most important non-family enterprise is education. She's already cut you out. They're not your kids. They do not belong to you. You do not have the primacy of what and when and what and how they learn. Education is the single most important non-family thing your kids are ever going to do. And there's the successor to all of this. Right? And if you're a homeschool mom and dad, you tell me what you just heard there. You tell me how you think. It may not, look, homeschooling is not going away tomorrow or next year or even in 5 years. But you tell me with an attitude like that, how long, if they nail down Common Core, you tell me how long you're going to be free to do this. The most important non-family, and I can think of nothing more family-oriented than education. I can think of no thing more central to the evolution, the development, the progress, the maturity of your kids in education. And she's cut you out, and the feds have cut you out. Not good. Go to this center, the Center for Teaching Quality, February 2015. They've done a very detailed analysis-based examination of how much time is going to be spent testing for Common Core in every class year. Fourth graders, the average fourth grader in this country is going to spend 51 days of a 180-day school year testing. And keep in mind that fourth grade isn't even one of the main testing years. Third grade is. Testing, prepping, and it makes sense. If the only thing your teachers are getting evaluated on are these tests, then they're going to have to prepare them for the tests. They're going to have to practice tests. They're going to have to test repeatedly. And if they're doing all that testing, guess what they're not doing? Learning. Exactly. And you know the thing that gets me about all of this? Ever since the Department of Education started meddling in this, and if you look at when American education really starts to waffle, it's in the late 1970s. Once you centralize education, Department of Education, everything but education became the Department of Education's issue. We've had 50 different academic studies done in the last 40 years, 50 of them, about the impact of standards at the state level and the federal level on college class, high school, middle school performance. Do you know what every one of those surveys, statistical analysis has proven? There is absolutely no connection between state standards and how your kids perform in the class. There's absolutely no connection between federal standards and how your kids perform in the classroom. One of the brilliant things about the Massachusetts standards is that they really weren't state standards at all. They empowered classrooms to reach certain objectives. They didn't take power away. Here's the dirty little secret. Do you know what the only standard that has ever worked in any classroom, ever? The only one? You need a committed parent, a disciplined child, and an effective teacher. That's it. That's all. You got those three. We became a superpower, did we not? On the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. Mary Calamy is that. Right? If you've got a good teacher and you've got disciplined kids and you've got a parent who's involved, that's how you teach. That you understand now that our Common Core is as far removed from the autonomy of that little triad as you could possibly get, unless the United Nations were to take over education. And don't think it's not possible. You know Bill Gates, and you can find this online. In 2004, Bill Gates, as a private citizen, signed a mutual agreement pact with UNESCO, the United Nations Education Organization, to bring exactly this kind of education from America to the rest of the world. Right now, you're not going to believe this. I got to throw a slide up here, but you're not going to believe this. This is one of those things I'll let you go find out. You research it for yourself. Do you know who the third largest private donor to Common Core is after Bill Gates and after Pearson Publishing? It's the Muammar Gaddafi family. I kid you not. Common Core, Pearson Publishing has opened publishing houses in Kuwait and Qatar. American Common Core is now going into Middle East schools in places like Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait already. That explains why, if you've been watching Common Core, moms and dads are really upset because there's so much Muslim advocacy in various textbooks that are associated with Common Core. There's got to be a quid pro quo, right? If the Gaddafis and people like them are pumping money into this, that's what they get out of it. There's nothing in the Common Core standards themselves that mandates Islamic apologetics, but by pairing and partnering Pearson with all the Emirate states of the Gulf, that's what they get back, right? More crony capitalism. So, I mentioned that we've had 50 studies that all show the same thing. You can have any standard you want at the state level. It really has very little impact on kids' performance. And when you go from the state to the federal level, it's utterly meaningless. Federal nationalized standards, they have absolutely no impact on your kids one way or the other. Here's the most recent of those studies. It was done by the left-leaning Brookings Institute, left-wing think tank. This was finished in 2012. This is the Brown Center Report for American Education. You can read the whole thing for free online and look at their data. I'm just going to read you the last two paragraphs. What effect will the Common Core have on national achievement? The analysis presented here suggests very little impact. The quality of the Common Core standards is currently being hotly debated, but the quality of past curriculum standards has been unrelated to student achievement. The rigor of performance standards, how high you're at the bar at the state or federal level, has also been unrelated to student achievement. No impact. You know what happened? When we were a great educational nation from 1900 to the 1960s, standards were controlled in the classroom. Then in the 70s, they got bumped to the districts, the 80s and 90s to the states, and now to the federal government. And every step you've taken, they've gotten worse, weaker, more inefficient, right? How about the last paragraph? Do not expect much from the Common Core. Education leaders often talk about standards as if they are some kind of system of weights and measures. The word benchmarks is used promiscuously as a synonym for standards. But the term is misleading by implying there is some real known standard of measurement. How do you measure 60 million American school kids? How do you create a big federal way that takes into account socioeconomic background, ethnicity, race, family stability, money spent, the quality of the teacher, the commitment of the parents? You can't. It's all meaningless garbage. It proves nothing. I like this. Standards in education are best, in other words, just aspirational. In other words, all these standards that we're fussing about that are completely taking over our schools, they're about like your New Year's Eve resolutions. You have a couple glasses of champagne, you go to bed, and you resolve that in the morning you're going to get up and jog 5 miles. That's a hell of a standard. I would say that that's a rigorous standard for Massachusetts weather, right? And yet, you got to get your butt out of bed. You got to put the shoes on. You got to get outside and do it. It has nothing to do with the standard. It's even worse here. It's like the standards in this case are best understood as aspirational. And like a strict diet or a prudent plan to save money, they represent good intentions not often realized. So again, you sold out Massachusetts for what? This isn't going to help your kids. But that's the catch, isn't it? How many American moms and dads hear the word standard and think this must be a good thing? Or assume there weren't any before? Or assume that somehow a federal government who can manage almost nothing well is somehow going to take over education and manage it well? I mean, what evidence do you have that they can do it? Name one thing you think they've really done a good job managing. I can't. And I'll walk back to Wisconsin. If you can tell me the last time the federal government took something over, failed it, and then gave it back to the people. They don't. That's the big... Okay, so we're downhill now. We can, maybe about an hour, a little bit more will be done. I want to spend some time on the standards. Before I do, I have to underscore this for you. Even if you think you like the standards, even if you think Common Core is a great idea, how in the world do we allow it to stand the way it was done? We are not a free people. We are not a constitutional republic anymore if this is allowed to stand. Even if you think it's a good idea. The deception, the lying, the baiting and switching, the false premises, the threats, the bullying, the blackmail and the intimidation, all done by people largely off the grid. Who is Bill Gates to be bragging about stimulus money going to the Department of Education? Who is David Coleman to tell you that your teachers, none of them ever, will ever be able to teach anything other than what we tell them to? Who is he to do that? Oh, it's a simple matter now to point out the flaws and deficiencies of the standards. I got to give you one tiny little last history lesson, then I'll stop. But this is a big one, because I think accountability and transparency matter. I'm trying to be transparent here by showing you where I'm getting all my information and giving it to you. But they haven't been. The Common Core people did something you might be tempted to think was a good idea. After the standards were finally written, they convened a committee. They brought in 29 people from across the country, came to Washington, D.C. They called this committee the Validation Committee. And the Common Core paid them to evaluate the Common Core standards. They gave this committee absolute carte blanche. That committee could throw the standards out, could rewrite them, could validate them, say they're great. The interesting thing about the Validation Committee is they only brought in one math specialist and one English specialist. That was it. Only one mathematician who had any experience writing standards, and only one professor of English who had any experience with this. And you know she's a native daughter, Dr. Sandy Stotsky from Massachusetts. She lives here. And she was a professor for a long time down at the University of Arkansas. She was one of the major players that wrote the Massachusetts standards, which were so good relatively. So Dr. Stotsky, the only English professor with any standard writing experience, she said about Common Core, and I quote, "Get rid of them. These standards in English writing and comprehension are going to keep our kids 3 years behind the 3 years they're already behind the rest of the world, the high-achieving nations of the world. Get rid of them." The math professor, if you can believe it, is even more impressive. He's a retired Stanford University math professor by the name of James Milgram. And most of the math that was done to get us to the moon in the 1960s, he did as a young man. Most of those calculations were his. He was the only math expert brought in, the only person with standard experience. And he said, and I quote, It is an absolute joke to take the Common Core math. We'll prepare your kids for college level math or for STEM careers. Careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. You know, those unimportant subjects. It's a joke, he said. Get rid of them immediately. Milgram and Stotsky convinced a bunch of other people on that committee to vote no. You know what the Common Core did? They just cut them out of the final document. They just erased them and their objections from the final report and validated anyway. That's why Sandy is traveling the country. We've had her in Wisconsin 4 times. She testified before our legislature. She's been all over the country like I have doing this. That's why Professor Milgram is traveling the country warning people about this. Transparency. The people Common Core hired said it's a disaster, many of them. And they were not listened to, they were merely erased. And that's a fact. And ask that, you can go type in Stotsky's name into Google, you'll hear her tell you 1,000 different websites, right? Well, she's been all over the place. So, this comes directly from Sandy, and it makes sense to me as an English professor. What's the problem with the English standards? Well, for starters, at every grade level in Common Core requires that kids do 50% more writing and 50% less reading than ever before. And we all know, everybody knows, that kids only learn how to write well after they have to learn how to read well. And as Sandy rightly points out, if they're really not reading much, what in the world are they writing about? Maybe that's how assignments like the one in Wisconsin a couple of years ago that went viral. Little eight-year-olds, little third graders, were sent home with an essay. Tell us how the state is just like the family, but better. That was the essay. As Sandy points out, this is absolute, and by the way, Sandy Stotsky and Jim Milgram are both lifelong Democrat voters. Even they are tinfoil hat wearing right now. But as Sandy points out, what you're setting up is a situation here where there is much, much more indoctrination going on in our schools about Common Core. Is that at every grade level, Common Core mandates that 50% of the literature that kids used to read in English classes is pulled out, and it's replaced by so-called informational texts, many of which come directly from the federal government. Why do you read literature in English class? When you put your kids and grandkids to bed at night, you read them a bedtime story, don't you? I mean, the purpose is to get them to go to sleep. So if you want them to go to sleep at night, why don't you read them a Bill Gates computer manual? You'll do a better job. You don't, though. You read them stories that get their little hearts pounding, their little eyelids fluttering. In other words, when you put them to bed, the stories are actually kind of wiring them up. But you do it because intrinsically you know that's how kids love to read stories. All that story core is being removed from Common Core. Government is being replaced. A lot of government. And as Sam read Shakespeare, who did when you play Shakespeare, when you read any Shakespeare, when you read any idea, Shakespeare, when you when you read Jane Austen would have voted out Jane energy of the vote you don't. Energy. When you in the class, you talk about the biggest, you talk truth, justice, love, war, truth, peace, art of war, politicized, right? You're right. Politicized. Right? Now you're pulling it out. And now you're replacing it with pretend, placing aside the political propaganda, of which I will show you, in a moment. So what do you got? Much less discussion about character, ethics, morality, and much more indoctrination. Much less class literature and much more information. Like these. By the time your daughter's a freshman in high school, this is an English class, by the time your daughter's a freshman in high school, she's going to be reading things like this. Recommended levels of insulation. A report released in 2010 by the EPA and the Department of Energy. Read it. It's a 50-page, it's not a story, it's a 50-page regulatory document about the environmentally correct way to insulate new buildings. Is that something that's calculated to make your freshman daughter want to read more? He rightly estimates that about 35% of the informational texts that are replacing literature in your kids' classroom all deal with man-made global warming and the undeniability of it and America's exclusive responsibility for it. That's it. Critical thinking, as Dr. Stotsky points out, is when you expose kids to multiple perspectives and you let them decide. They don't do that in Common Core. It's all one side all the time. By the time your son's in 10th grade, how about this little gem? They're going to be reading President Obama's own executive order in the White House. Executive Order 13423, strengthening federal education, mental energy, and transportation management. How about a long essay on the evolution of the grocery bag? Spoiler alert, paper and plastic California legislature to ban plastic bags across the state. They did. No plastic bags in California. And many, many more like these. Even if you think it is the job of the schools to convince your kids of global warming, why are they doing this in English? And what aren't you doing if you're doing this stuff? Right? As Sandy points out, of what little literature is actually left in the course, why did they pick much of it? Much of it is, you heard the Washington Democrat, you heard the Chicago Union label Common Core developmentally inappropriate. One of the things they meant by that, part of the world of what little literature is left in Common Core is so much so rapidly sexual. Why is there so much quasi-pornography in high school? Why are there so many sexually inappropriate assignments with kids in younger grades? What is doing this? One book in question is, this is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Now, Morrison is a great writer. She's an African-American novelist. She's a Nobel Prize winner. But he would not assign this book to President Trump. It's all about a 12-year-old girl who's a victim of rape. And in the course of the book, she comes to bond with her rapist. And she writes in shockingly graphic terms about the nature of sexual encounters. This book is pulled out of Common Core classrooms for kids in middle school, 8th grade. This book is pulled out of Common Core classrooms for Catholic students as young as 8th grade middle school. I blocked out the bad words, you may not be able to see it all that well. But you get a sense, I think, from this, of the kind of stuff that's in this book. There are over 3 dozen books like this. Books like Black Swan, books like Reading in Cuban, that have started almost on every sexuality, almost on every day. Why, as Dr. Gottlieb points out, if you're going to take that all literature, why do you put this stuff in the book? So between the government propaganda and the radical sexualization of what is the purpose of these English standards? And it's not just a high school kid. Here is a typical Common Core assignment for an 8-year-old, 3rd grade. Notice that Mom crossed it out. You got moms all across the country. Moms all across the country are sending back homework assignments saying, I'm not telling my kids this. Mom crossed it out and she wrote, inappropriate. I'm not explaining this to an 8-year-old. Let me read the paragraph. You know, it's a typical English assignment. Send the kid home a paragraph or a page and have them read it. And then answer some questions. What is the main theme of the paragraph? What are the main characters? Okay, great. Perfectly acceptable assignment. Now listen to the paragraph that Common Core sent home to the 8-year-old. Ruby sat on the bed she shared with her husband, holding a hair clip. There was something mysteriously powerful about the cheaply manufactured neon hair clip that she was fondling in her newly stitched palms. She didn't recognize the hair clip. It was too big to be their daughter's, and Ruby was sure it wasn't hers. She hadn't had friends over in weeks. But here was this hair clip, blue and green, with a few long black hair strands caught in it. Ruby ran her fingers through her own blonde hair. She had just been vacuuming when she noticed the small bright green object by the bed. Now their light would never be the same. She would wait here until her husband might came home. And of course, to get the right answer, the astute 8-year-old had to conclude that Dad's having an adulterous affair in Mom's bed. So even for the way the math questions are staged involve, and I'll show you some of those in a moment, highly sexualized situations. What do they do? There's an obvious answer for this. Are you ready to hear it? You want to wait? The obvious answer to this is one of the ways you pull kids away from their parents, one of the ways you break kids down, particularly from the Judeo-Christian morality they get in the home, one of the ways you undercut that so you can make them better citizens of the state is to sexualize them at young ages. Shockingly and frankly, as a way of breaking down the morality moms are trying to instill, because then you can reinscribe them. And so what? Let's talk about the math for a moment. We're going to come back and double back around. So I'm talking to Jim, we had Milgram come to Wisconsin too, talking to the good professor about Common Core math. And he's bemused by it. He's convinced it's an absolute failure. It's not just a failure, it's dangerous. In asking him what his major concerns about Common Core math were, he said, well, first of all, it's a lie that it's ever been tested. First thing I did when I got to the committee, he said, is, okay, you say you benchmarked this. Show me the math. And the whole time he was on that committee, they never provided. In fact, 6 years into Common Core, no one has ever seen any evidence that any real scientific analysis is ever done. all just a sham. That was his first problem. Second problem, he says, is that Common Core is designed. Its main idea is not to teach your kids math at a high level. It is, what he calls it is social justice math. And what does he mean by that? Think about your own days in school. What percentage of kids in any given math class could really, really intuitively get math? 10%, 15 maybe? And the higher you go, the fewer the kids that can really get it, right? Math is hard. We're not all geared for it. Look, when I was in third grade, I had a second grade reading level. And I still have when I was in third grade, I had a second grade math level. I still have a second grade math level. I mean, in my math, I can basically balance check with a lead 10. Although, I always do 20% because I can't figure out that math. They do all right. But I've managed, despite what my wife says, I've managed to be moderately successful in life. But when I was in third grade, I also had a high school reading level. And I was allowed to read high school books. Probably why I ended up high finance world and English professor, right? Because I could read. Do you know that we've lost more gifted and talented education programs in the last 2 years than in the last 40 years combined? Because this is not common. If your kids are common, then no kid gets to jump ahead in any one area. The purpose of Common Core is not to let your kid figure out what she's good at and give her a basic education while encouraging her on what she's good at. It's designed to force all kids to be the same kid, hence common, right? So in me, I could really read ahead in English, but I was behind in math. Both of those things now have to be corrected. And the only way you correct it is to pull me down. In fact, with things like Common Core, kids who exceed the standard are actually a bigger problem than kids who fail it. Because you can always dumb down a standard. Every time you lower the standard a tick, more kids get included. Every time you raise the standard a tick, more kids fall off. Common Core, as Professor Milgram says, is aiming for a culture where every kid knows a little bit of math, but no kid knows more than anybody else. And the only way you do that is to punish the kids who really understand math. How? Well, take a listen to this. Hard to make this up. The young woman in the video, she is a community organizer from Chicago. And now she's the curriculum director at Illinois Gray Lake School System. In this short clip, she lays out the fundamental philosophy of Common Core math.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the way we...
In other words, if a kid can explain why they thought a wrong answer was right, they get credit for it. Not partial credit. We're much more concerned about the thinking. And look, one of the primary ways, as Milgram reminds us, that Common Core math is taught to elementary school kids, the youngest kids, where math foundations are built, teachers don't teach it anymore. You take a group of elementary school kids, you put them in groups of 2 and 3, and you hand them simple math problems. The purpose of the assignment for the kids is not to get the right answer. It's to get all 3 kids in the group to agree on what they think the answer is. So we have a ridiculous situation in New York where a 2nd grade boy, 3rd grade boy, is taking a math exam, and the question is 7 times 6. He writes 42, but he gets the answer mark wrong. And the teacher writes, the other 2 kids in your peer group agreed on a different answer. So they got it right. You didn't agree with your peers, and so he got it marked wrong, even though he was the only one in the group who had the right answer. And so, as Milgram points out, what do we mean by social justice? It's not fair that some kids are better in certain subjects than others. The way we write that social injustice is to insist that all kids become the same math student. And can we do the math here for just a minute that your schools won't do? You're going to get 60 million kids to the exact same place in math. Is that going to be a high or a low place? Doesn't it have to be? It has to be. Simple, lowest common denominator. That's a math term, right? Yeah. I'm not that. And then you get this, right? Professor Milgram also, this is absolutely shocking. The woman in this video, the mother, who you don't see her, you hear her. The mother in this video, 3rd grade daughter, 8-year-old, she's a university math professor. And she cannot help her daughter, her 8-year-old, with her Common Core math homework, right? And so watch this little video unfold, and you'll get a sense of what we're talking about. Here's your difficult math problem. Add 1568, 1423, and 680.
So what I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school? And talk to me while you're solving it.
So we learned that a big square like this is 100. So we could make that 100 into a cube, which would make it 1,000.
So a square is 100 and a cube is 1,000.
So let's just say that's 1,000. And now we still have to do 500. Could make that into 5
So
sheets.
you notice how nobody's adding anything? This is just what you have to do to get the first number on the board.
And we have 6 sheets. So just 9.
The lines are tens. Now you gotta put the second number on the board.
We got 1,000. And that represents what?
Okay.